series, I believe, on Amazon. So those are the dates. Okay. Rafi, you ready? We're going to do, let me introduce you. So this is Rabbi Dr. Raphael Zarum. He's the Dean of the London School of Jewish Studies. He has a doctorate in theoretical physics, a master's in education, and is a graduate of the Mandel Leadership School in Jerusalem. Rafi is a sought-after lecturer with wildly innovative and meaningful readings of Torah, Midrash, Talmud, and the Jewish festivals that reference modern literature, cinema, and culture. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Dr. Raphael Zarum from Finchley, the UK. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Ari, and it's great to see so many people online here. I'm small on this picture. I don't know why, but it doesn't matter. As long as I'm big on your screen, that's okay. And we're going to be talking tonight about Winston Churchill, who I have to honestly admit is one of my heroes. A fascinating, wonderful man. And I've read a lot of his books and his histories. And there's a famous question of what was his attitude towards the Jews and how important is Churchill for Jewish history. Now, there's a great shocking resonance to this day because, as you might know, with the Black Lives Matter movement and the important things that they're doing, but unfortunately there's a small group of violent protesters who are doing annoying things. And some correctly, so some are slave owners and quite nasty, nefarious people who had statues in England. Some of those statues have been removed, but at the time it kind of got out of hand and people started getting upset with anybody who was slightly racist. And on a very important Churchill statue, we'll see it at the end of the lecture, they actually spray painted racist on it, which really upset a lot of people in government and the country as well. That's been cleaned up by now. But so Churchill is again in the press, but probably the greatest Briton to have ever lived and one of the heroes, definitely of the 20th century. Without Churchill, there's no winning of the Second World War. And as I'll show you now, without Churchill, there is no state of Israel. It's as simple as that. And we have to understand and see the history to understand why. And the most important influence on Churchill's life in terms of Judaism is basically the Jews of Manchester, as I will show you in the lecture. And when I visit Manchester, I tell them that. And we'll see that. So let me share you with my handout. And this handout has a lot more than I'm going to tell you because it's there are quotes from his articles and books and other information. So I will send it to Ari afterwards, and anybody who wants the PDF of it can get it. I might even put it on the chat at the end if I get a chance. So here it is. What did Churchill really think of the Jews? A tale of admiration, suspicion, and religious conviction, as you'll see. He's the greatest British statesman. He won the Nobel Prize in '53 for literature. And these are the basic facts summarized on one page here of his connection to the Jews. So he started off as the MP. MP is the Member of Parliament for, I suppose you might call it senator. So he was the Member of Parliament for Oldham and then Manchester Northwest. Right, he spent 6 years there, and there was a large Jewish community that he was very friendly with, as we'll see. And that was very important for him at the time. By the way, you can ask questions at the end, but if I'm talking too fast or unclearly, just put in the chat, slow down, exclamation mark, or speak English, exclamation mark, and I will do that. I said it last time, but since it's Churchill, I've got to quote it. Churchill said that Britain and America are two countries divided by a common language. Thank you, Marilyn. I will slow down. So we are divided by a common language, so you have to get used to my accent. So do your best. When I was in yeshiva, the rabbis always got the British people to read. They said that the Bible sounds so much more compelling and true when a Brit reads it as opposed to an American. But who knows? Anyway, so between 1906 and 1900 and 1906, he was the Member of Parliament for Oldham and then another place in Manchester. And in that time, he fought the Aliens Act, which was a restrictive legislation on immigration. So very early on, Churchill had very progressive and open-minded views. In 1921 to 22, he was the Secretary of State for the colonies. You have to remember, the British Empire had many colonies. They were part of the empire, but they were independent places. And that's why it was called Britain's Mandate in different areas. And for 8 days, he visits Palestine, which at the time was home to 84,000 Jews and nearly 600,000 Arabs. And he was part of the White Paper of 1922, which supported Zionism and Jewish immigration. You might have heard of a different paper, the Black Paper, as it were. A White Paper is the name of a piece of legislation put through Parliament. And in 1939, There was a second Palestinian white paper drafted by the Colonial Office, which was known amongst the Jews as the Black Paper. It was before he comes to power, by the way. Churchill is not in power at this point. It laid an immigration limit of 75,000 Jews for the next 5 years. Now, if that had been kept to, there never would have been a state. Because when the state began, the number of Arab nations and people who attacked Israel, it would have made it impossible to survive. But WSC, Winston Spencer Churchill, opposed it when he became he opposed it when it happened, and when he became prime minister a year later, he completely ignored it. As you know, he comes to power in 1940 after France has collapsed and all seems lost, and it looks like Hitler is going to take over Europe and ultimately the world. And Churchill comes to power. Was he going to make it? You've all seen the movies now, right? You might have seen Darkest Hour or other books, but there's a famous research about what happened in those first 5 days when his cab driver says, "It's okay, now you're here, Mr. Churchill." And Churchill responded and said, "You know, it might be too late." It was a big risk to take on and fight the Nazis and not try for appeasement. And it's an incredible time. There's a book, which I'll refer to later, which talks about these 5 days in May where everything changed. Anyway, we know what he did during the Second World War. But straight after the war ends, he's out of power and Labour comes into power. Churchill's a conservative. And in 1951, he finally comes back as a prime minister again. And he writes to Weizmann that the state of Israel's continued success is important. As he says, an old Zionist like me. So we know that Churchill himself saw himself as a Zionist. And in 61, he actually met Ben Gurion in his London home. They had a wonderful chat. And in 65, Churchill dies. So that's an overview of his life. But I want to show you now from his writings and events that happened to him, his relationship with the Jews. Now, if you want, I've taken it from a number of places. I've read a number of books, but the best book on the subject is clearly the one by Sir Martin Gilbert, a brilliant British historian called Churchill and the Jews. Basically, Sir Martin Gilbert was Churchill's official biographer from the state. And it's a 14-volume work of Churchill's entire life. But I could tell what Gilbert was doing. Every time something about Jews came along, he put it in a box. And eventually, after he'd finished his official biography of Churchill, he then published a smaller book called Churchill and the Jews, with every connection between Winston Churchill and Jews that you can find. And it's a really interesting book. And I'm going to quote from it, but I'm going to bring other essays and articles as well. Because I'm interested not just on physical acts that Churchill did that relates to Jews, but his attitude, his philosophy. Did you know, for instance, that Churchill wrote an essay about Moses? A fascinating essay, what he thought of it. He wrote a letter, he wrote an article about different kinds of Jews, good Jews and bad Jews. We'll come onto all these things as we go through. So let's go to the next page. Here we go. This is very important. This is Churchill and his wife Clementine in October 1908 at the opening of the new wing of the Manchester Jewish Hospital. It was the couple's first official engagement appearance after they were married. Why? As I told you, until 1906, he had been the MP, the minister in Manchester, and had loved the Jewish community very much. And when in 1908, they built a special hospital. Remember, this is before the National Health Service. This is in the days before that, when there were just local hospitals that had to be built. When they built a Manchester Jewish hospital that was open for all, they invited Churchill to come and open it. And look what it says. In 1908, no longer a member of Parliament, he returns to Manchester to open a new wing. When he, and there's a quote of what he said when he'd been a member. He said, although he was no longer their member, that interest still continued. He was very glad to have the experience of watching the life and work of the Jewish community in England. There was a high sense of responsibility in the community. There was a great sense of duty, which was fostered on every possible occasion. So lessons of community to the young Churchill who just got married, who was just getting married, really affected this man. This is what society could be. The tightly bound, caring, religious Jewish community showed him what community could be. The Jewish hospital, Churchill declared, was one of the instances of corporate responsibility by which the Jews of Manchester were animated. There was so much sickness and so much destitution. He knew that it was the glory of that hospital, that it was open to all of whatever creed or race, whatever might be their condition of life. A great moral example that the Jews were doing in Manchester. He would always cherish the key to the hospital with which he'd been presented, not only for his connection to the hospital, but also as a memento and as a token of the Jewish community in Manchester, from whom he'd been in the past received so many kindnesses, from whom he'd always cherished warm feelings of friendship and respect. I think Churchill learnt his attitude and relationship to the Jews in those early days, impressionable young man, when he saw how much they cared for him. The leaders of the community met him regularly, and they knew Clementine, and he came to tea in their homes and had a deep connection. And that hospital lasted till 1992, till when it was incorporated into the General North Manchester Hospital. But to this day, if you go into one wing, it's called the Jewish Victoria Wing, named after Queen Victoria, who Churchill absolutely loved. So it's an important early part of his history. Now we get to another major stage, and one more quote from that period as well. He said, personally, my heart, this is 1921, so it's a similar period. Personally, my heart is full of sympathy for Zionism. This sympathy has existed for a long time, since 12 years ago, when I was in contact with the Manchester Jews. I believe that the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine will be a blessing to the world. So you never know when a senator or a governor comes to your synagogue, but the way you act when he or she hears the announcements that you make, and the way you build community, how that might affect that young political leader years down the line when they're possibly running your country or another one. These things are so, so important. But let's move on to the most challenging part of Churchill. And people use this article, sadly, to try and argue he was anti-Semitic. Because in this very long essay, and I'm only going to summarize parts of it to you, he talks about the danger. You can see here, it was put in the newspaper. Here's the picture of the newspaper down here. Zionism versus Bolshevism, a struggle for the soul of the Jewish people. This guy is only in his 30s or 40s when he writes this article, but he has an opinion, right? What's he worried about? He's worried about the rise of Bolshevism in Russia. And he sees many Jews involved in that. And he's very worried about that. And he writes an article in a major newspaper. And this is the complete, well, almost complete translation. And I'm just going to read a bit of it to you to see his attitude. But you see the way he writes his attitude to these things. Look at this. I mean, I don't know if you could write this today. Some people like Jews and some do not. But no thoughtful man can doubt the fact that they are beyond question the most formidable and the most remarkable race which has ever appeared in the world. We Jews love being praised by other people, right? We love that. But look at the way he's writing. Good Jew, and these are the subtitles in the essay. Can you imagine writing this today? Good Jews and bad Jews. The conflict between good and evil, which proceeds unceasingly in the breast of man, nowhere reaches such intensity as in the Jewish race. The dual nature of mankind is nowhere more strongly or more terribly exemplified. And he talks about the positives and the negatives of Jews. Look at this, he says this line over here. This mystic and mysterious race has been chosen for supreme manifestations, both the divine and the diabolical. See, people misunderstand. You have to read the whole essay to really appreciate what he's saying. I've even cut bits for you here because it's so long. But he talks about three kinds of Jews. And by the way, before he talks about Jews as a whole, you're probably worrying, wait a second, he's tarnishing the entire every individual with the attitude of the nation. So look at this introductory paragraph, which is so useful for these issues, and especially with the challenge of issues of racism around the world today. It's very remarkable how he writes. He says, there can be no greater mistake than to attribute to each individual a recognizable share in the qualities which make up the national character. Think about that. He says, there are all sorts of men, good, bad, and for the most part, indifferent in every country and in every race. Nothing is more wrong than to deny an individual, on account of race or origin, his right to be judged on his personal merits and conduct. That's a direct attack on racism, right? In a people of peculiar genius like the Jews, contrasts are even more vivid. The extremes are more widely separated, resulting more divisive. So he says that there isn't just one typical Jew. He now says there's three kinds of Jews around today. Where does he say that? Yes, at the present fateful period, there are three main lines of political conception amongst the Jews. Again, he's only talking about political. He's not mentioning about spiritual or ultimate character. But politically, there's three kinds of Jews. Two which are helpful and hopeful to a very high degree to humanity, and one which is destructive. And then he goes through and describes them. The first good kind is the loyal Jew. First, there are the Jews who, dwelling in every country throughout the world, identify themselves with that country, enter into its national life, and adhere faithfully to their religion, and regard themselves as citizens in the fullest sense of the state with which has received them. okay? Good British Jews who read the prayer for the Queen every week in synagogue, and good American Jews who have the American flag and the Israel flag in their synagogues and make a prayer for the president. That's the number one. He values that as loyal British Jews of the country. That's good. The number two he's very worried about. He calls them international Jews and then terrorist Jews. These are the ones who have joined the Bolshevist ideas in Russia and are developing in that revolution and causing incredible violence in the world. He argues, and this is why people say he was racist, that the Jews are more involved in Bolshevism than other peoples. And it's a big debate whether that's true or not. But from his point of view, what he knew many Jews were involved, and he was trying to warn off Jews from getting involved in that culture. That's the second approach. And the third approach, he says, is Zionism, a home for the Jews. Zionism offers the third sphere to the political conceptions of the Jewish race. In violent contrast to international communism, it presents to the Jew a national idea of a commanding character. It has fallen to the British government as a result of the conquest of Palestine. Remember, he's writing this in 1920, during the British Mandate, to have the opportunity and the responsibility of securing for the Jewish race all over the world a home and a centre for national life. The statesmanship and historic sense of Mr. Balfour were prompt to seize this opportunity. And he talks about the importance of Zionism and how good an approach it is for the Jews. So he's pro-Jews who are loyal to their country, Jews who want to build their own country in Israel, but he's against Jews getting involved in communism, which was a big threat, as you know, in the 20s. The duty of loyal Jews. Let's end the article. It is particularly important in these circumstances that the national Jews in every country who are loyal to the land of their adoption should come forward on every occasion, as many in England as already have done, and take a prominent part in every measure of combating the Bolshevik conspiracy. So you can see what he's calling to that argument. And then he ends and says, positive and practical alternatives are needed in the moral as well as the social sphere in building up the utmost rapidity a Jewish national centre in Palestine. This is Zionist, right? In the 1920s, he's saying there should be a Jewish national centre in Palestine, which become not only a refuge to the oppressed from unhappy lands of Central Europe, but which will also be a symbol of Jewish unity and a temple of Jewish glory. A task is present on which many blessings rest. So when you read the full article, he's not being anti-Semitic. He's saying, I'm worried about certain Jews joining certain cultural groups from a political point of view. But he's clearly pro the Jews who are loyal to their home and a Zionist in very early days when many other conservatives weren't. It's another important part of Churchill's life. Now we come to the famous Balfour Declaration. You all know about this. In 1917, Lord Rothschild, where even though there was a British mandate, they looked in favour of producing a Jewish national home in the land of Israel. And here's an article describing Churchill's attitude towards it. And it's a long article. I've just quoted the key part, but I've got the full reference here. You can get a hold of it on the internet, the Balfour Project. But it says some interesting things about Churchill. It says the following. Winston Churchill, colonial secretary, as we learned, between 21 and 22, right? He's basically the foreign minister, effectively. Oh, that's English language. I don't know what you'd call it. The foreign secretary, minister in charge of, what's the phrase? Someone type in the chat what you call it in America.
Secretary of State.
Secretary of State, that's it. But remember, but you have mandated countries that you're in charge of. They're called the colonies, and Israel's part of that. So Churchill is basically the head of a whole bunch of countries when you think about it. Incredible amount of power. He played a vital role in securing the British government's long-term commitment to the terms of the Balfour Declaration of 1917. It can indeed be argued that without his efforts in the face of mounting domestic opposition in the press and parliament, the British could well have abandoned or at least radically modified their wartime promise to support the establishment of a Jewish national home. So that promise was made during World War I, but they would have shirked on it. We know the British had a love affair with the Arabs. We know that. You just have to look at the film Lawrence of Arabia to appreciate there was a kind of, it's difficult to understand this, but you have to read the writings of T.H. Lawrence and others in this country. They had a kind of wistful, kind of mystical view of the Arabs and the way they lived, and the British wanted to go there and explore and become themselves. And they really related to that. They did not relate to poor European, East European Jews. So Churchill was unusual. But you see, Churchill knew the Jews of Manchester, who were British, who were dignified, who he could relate to. That's why he had that connection to them. It wasn't so much the Jews of Europe that he knew of Eastern Europe. It was the Jews of Britain. By the way, I wasn't saying this because I'm British. I researched this and I was blown away by the truth of this. Look at this statement. The state of Israel might indeed be seen to owe its existence as much to Winston Churchill as to Arthur Balfour. As colonial secretary, he implemented the Balfour Declaration, ensured that Jews retained the right to immigrate to Palestine, advanced several significant enduring intellectual defenses of Zionism, and insisted to the Palestinian Arabs that they accept Zionism and allowed the Zionists to establish durable national institutions, which was set in motion in the founding of the state in 1948. Okay, but now here's the hard bit. There is, however, a conundrum. Despite the powerful legacy, Churchill was not by any means a consistently vigorous supporter of Zionism. Sometimes he argued with it. That's the article we're talking about earlier, but it's a mistake because he supported Zionism. Okay, Zionism was for him always subordinate to the wider imperial concerns. His attachment to the cause was weak in the 1910s and 20s. Strategic, imperial, political factors always ignore Zionism, and sometimes he resented it. Now, I disagree with this article because when you read what Churchill says, he's critical of some Jews, and obviously he's a British politician and his country comes first. But with all else being equal, he's definitely pro. There's comments in the chat here. Oh, yes. Okay. Sorry with the cursor. I'll stop that. Fine. The question then is, how could someone of such skepticism and periodic hostility prove crucial to the consolidation of Balfour and the launching of a trajectory towards the formation of enduring Jewish polity in Palestine? Why was Churchill so pro? And I've argued it's partly Manchester, and it's partly, as we'll see now, his religious convictions. He was a good Christian. And Churchill, from a very early on, was writing essays. I've got lots of collections. I'm sure you know his famous quotations, but he wrote many essays on many different subjects. And in an early collection, he wrote an essay called Moses, the leader of a people. And again, I'm not going to read all of this to you. It's fascinating, but he basically retells the story of the Exodus. Now, in 1931, that's before the 1956 Cecil B. DeMille, the Ten Commandments, but it's after the 1926, I think it is. Was it 26? Black and white, original Cecil B. DeMille Ten Commandments that was made. So the idea of dramatizing the Exodus was already, recognized in the world. Look what he says in the second paragraph. The Israelites were serviceable folk. Nevertheless, their ceaseless multiplication became a growing embarrassment. There was a limit to the store depots that were required, and the available laborers soon exceeded the opportunities for their useful economic employment. He's writing economically, he's using English economics to describe Exodus chapter 1, right? We know they built store cities, right? Are Miskanot, chapter 1, I think, chapter 1 of Exodus, verse 11. Are Miskanot et Pitom vet Ramses. They built the store cities of Pitom and Ramses. What does he call them? He calls them supply depots, store depots. It's amazing. He uses 20th century English language to describe the Bible, but it really brings it to life. And then he says, finally, they determined to have the male infants killed. There was evidently a strong tension between the principles of Jewish life and the ruthless force of Egyptian civilization. Now, why are we reading an essay about Moses? Because it gives us an insight into the ideology and the thinking of Churchill and the importance of leaders. He's going to focus on Moses. And this is a fairly young Churchill writing at this point, 1930. So he's, a bit older. He's 50. He's in his 50s now. So he's grown as a leader, and he's influenced by Moses as a leader himself. He says, the child is a man nurtured in the palace, but he is no Egyptian, no child of sheltered progeny of the Nile Valley. The wild blood of the desert, the potent blood of Bnei Israel, not yet mingled with the Hittite infusions, is in his veins. It's wild. This kind of writing, he's turning him into this great hero. And I think where T. Lawrence idealized the Arabs of the desert as heroes, Churchill is seeing it in an old Jew called Moses. He walks abroad. He sees what is going on. He sees his own race exploited beyond all economic or social justice. And now the key bit I wanted you to read about a prophecy. Every prophet has to come from civilization. Now, I'll just read in advance, and you'll know what we're looking at. I think Churchill is describing what a political leader has to be. And I think he's describing how either he sees himself or how he wants to see himself. Every prophet has to come from civilization, but every prophet has to go into the wilderness. He must have a strong impression of a complex society and all that it has to give, and then he must serve periods of isolation and meditation. This is the process by which psychic dynamite is made. That's what happened to Churchill. After being an MP in 1906, he went into the political wilderness. He didn't have the leadership role for many, many years until the 20s, when he had that limited role for 2 or 3 years, as we learned in the colonies, and then he was in the wilderness again. It was a real shock that he made it back in 39. If you watch the movie, there were posters in London saying, "What price Churchill?" Only because British government had failed so badly that they want to bring Churchill back. But he had stayed in his home in Chartwell, in the south, an hour's drive from the south of London, and from the south of London, and kept up with what was going on in the world. He knew strategy. He knew how much arms and guns and tanks the French had. He knew what was going on and the ability of the British Air Force. So when he came to power, he knew exactly what to do. He'd been in the wilderness, but he was growing. Psychic dynamite. He saw the burning bush. And look what he says. Perhaps it was not a bush at all, but his own heart that was aflame with a fire never to be quenched while the earth supports human beings. Now, again, we could spend a lot of time on this, but I want you to read it. I'll send you the handout in your own time. It's wonderful how he describes the Bible, and he's writing it like a Hollywood director. He's excited by the magic of this. Just 2 questions. Maria's asking, if he was the south of England, how come he represented Manchester? So when you are young, the way it works in England is what happens is if you're a young MP and you want to get a post, then you will travel. So if there's a seat that can be contested in a certain area, you'll go there. So Manchester, there was a Conservative seat he wanted to go for. So he moved to Manchester and then would live there. Later on, he goes south to Chartwell. That's what someone was asking me. Someone's comparing his connection to Manchester with Truman's connection with Jewish business Eddie Jackson. Possibly, I don't know. But I do know that Churchill was very close to Chaim Weizmann, as you know, who was the first president of the state of Israel. Why? Because Weizmann was a chemist and developed some chemical materials that were important in bombs, which Churchill really wanted to know about. You don't appreciate how many things Churchill invented the tank, right? And the story of how he invented it is wild, in terms of getting tracks and putting them onto some kind of car so he can get over mud. And he gets money experimenting on building these things. Some wacky ideas he had, but the tank turned out to work. Fascinating, creative man. Anyway, we could do a lot more of this essay. Just want to show you on the second column over here, just this wonderful line he says, "We reject with scorn all those learned and labored myths that Moses was but a legendary figure upon whom the priesthood and the people hung their essential social, moral, and religious ordinances." He says, people say it's not true. He says, I say it's true. And look at this. We remain unmoved by the tombs of Professor Gradgrind and Dr. Dry as Dust. He's digging at the academics who say, oh, it's not true, any of this in this Bible. You don't have to take it seriously. Churchill, you can see, he's a passionate man. He loves the mythology, the incredible narration of the Bible. And as a good Christian, it truly inspires him. So because he loves the Jews of the Bible, he loves the Jews of today. And yet there's a key point here. He says that we made a mistake. Remember, he's a Christian. He's got to say how the Jews made a mistake in their own Bible. So what does he say? Unluckily, the stresses of the Exodus, the long 40 years, or whatever the period may have been, which was needed in the wilderness to sharpen the children of Israel from a domesticated race into an armed force of conquering warriors, led them to make undue claims about God. They forgot the older traditions which the Pentateuch enshrines. They forgot the enlightened monotheism which under the heretic Pharaoh Akhenaten had left its impression upon Egypt. They appropriated God for themselves. In Renan's words, they made him revoltingly partial to the chosen people. All divine laws and ordinary equity were suspended or disallowed when they applied to a foreigner, especially to a foreigner whose land and property they required. So when at the end of the Torah they conquer the land of Israel, Jews become particularist, non-universalist. We reject the gods of the nations of the place, and we build our own country and believe that God is our God and that we are chosen to be a people. Now, Churchill rejects that, which is classic Christianity. What did Jesus come along and do? God is not just for the Jewish people, it's universalization. So Churchill loves the older parts of the Old Testament. He loves Moses and that leadership and all those exciting, dramatic stories. But when it comes to chosen people or being not for everybody, he has to reject that as a Christian. So it's subtle, the point here, but he still values the beginnings of Jewish ideas. Look what he puts. But these are natural errors of the human heart under exceptional circumstances. Many centuries were to pass before God then spake in the burning bush, was to manifest himself in a new revelation, which nevertheless was the oldest of all the inspirations of the Hebrew people, as God not only of Israel, but of all mankind. This is going into Christianity, as you can see. So this is in 1931. Churchill is in the wilderness. He's in Chartwell, but the whole world comes to visit him. Einstein comes to visit him, the greatest scientist of the day, and he goes to visit people as well. Here he is, Charlie Chaplin and Winston Churchill on the set of City Lights. Right, Churchill's in his 50s, but look at him. The word in English we'd say is dapper. He's conscious of how he looks, right? So he's excited. He's a passionate man, even at this stage. Okay, now let's move on to the great moments where we've got about 20 minutes to go. We've got time for this, yes. Let's now move on to the war, the most important time where he truly becomes a national hero. Right, tough as nails. And this is the book. It will take you some time to read, but it's called 5 Days in London by John Lucas. It's absolutely fantastic. The movie Finest Hour is pretty much based on this book. Right, those 5 days, what was going on, how near we came to the brink. And it's incredibly written. It's literally at one point hour by hour. Right, look what he says. Churchill saw Hitler and his Reich as incarnating something evil and dangerous, some of the brutal sources of which may have been very old, but some of which were alarmingly new. And his vision was such that he turned out to be the savior not only of England, but of much else besides, essentially of all of Europe. He was very much aware of this. On the 28th of May, he spoke of the world cause to which we have avowed ourselves. On the 14th of July, he declared that Britain was fighting by ourselves alone, but not for ourselves alone. London was the strong city of refuge, which enshrines the title deeds of human progress and is the deep consequence of Christian civilization. Two things to point out here. Number one, Churchill turns Hitler not just into the enemy, but to evil. This was the eternal fight of good versus evil, which inspired my entire country. We felt we were fighting not just to win a battle against someone attacking us, but for right and for truth. And notice the language he uses, the strong city of refuge. In Hebrew, Ir Miklat. This is a Jewish idea at the end of the book of Numbers, a place of refuge. He's bringing in biblical imagery. In 1941, in a broadcast to the United States, he said the following: "In these British islands that look so small upon the map, we stand, the faithful guardians of the right and dearest hopes of a dozen states and the nations now gripped and tormented in a base and cruel servitude." He wanted America to join the war. You know this. FDR Roosevelt was very inspired by Churchill. We know this. By Roosevelt's bed were Churchill's books of history with underlining that Roosevelt had done. We've seen this. Right? It's in the Congress libraries. We've seen these things. And Churchill would give his speeches trying to push Roosevelt and America to join. He said, "We are small, but we are the front line and we want America to join us." At the end of May 1940, and for some time thereafter, not only the end of a European war, but the end of Western civilization was near. Churchill knew that, and inspired as he was by a kind of historical consciousness that entailed more than just rhetoric. So he was trying to mobilize entire countries to this fight. And in a famous phrase, which we know is mentioned in the movie Finest Hour, after his great speech, when he was booed at the time, but cheered at the end, it said that Churchill has mobilized the English language. So mobilization meant arming and getting ready to fight. He mobilized language. And the importance of rhetoric was very important, but he knew that he needed to back things up. But what about the Jews? What about the Jews? Look what he said. This is in 1944 during the war, right? And remember, he's the Prime Minister of England. He's fighting the war. He's a huge leader. By this time, America's involved, Russia's involved. He's dealing with huge issues, and yet he finds time to make this comment. It's written in Hansard. Hansard is the official writing publication of everything said in the House of Parliament. Every public speech of all time is in the House of Parliament, going back hundreds of years, is in Hansard. My mother, for a period of time, worked typing it up because it's on tapes, and they sent it all over the country. And typist, she types 80 words a minute, would type it up. So she worked for many years typing these things, not for Churchill, but for much later. She actually worked on the Eichmann trial as well when she lived in Israel, typing that up. Very interesting stuff. Anyway, he said the following in 1944 in public: "I know there are vast numbers of Jews serving with our forces and the American forces throughout all our armies, but it seems to me indeed appropriate that a special Jewish unit, a special unit of that race which has suffered indescribable torment from the Nazis, should be represented as a distinct formation among the forces gathering for the final overthrow." He wanted the Jews to be able to fight as a Jewish brigade, be part of the winning, because at this point he knew he was winning to an extent in the war. Okay, and this was in September. In October, Brigadier Ernest Benjamin, commander of the Jewish Brigade, inspects the 2nd Battalion in Palestine. It came to be. There was a Jewish brigade that existed from 44 to 46. The church, because in those times, it's hard to imagine now, but Churchill said, you know, these Jews, they've been through hell. They should be able to fight as a proud Jewish brigade. And they did. If you go on the internet, you can see the insignia and the logo and the medals of the Jewish brigade. So Churchill thinks of all these things. When you're running a war, a good leader is thinking of every aspect, how to engage every aspect of culture and every aspect of society. And now we come to a part that I really can't explain in any great depth. I'll do it very briefly and show you a summary. But this speech, if you get a chance to read it from Hansard, is where Churchill explains how he basically built the land of Israel. And what he said was the following, and this is the key paragraph over here. It's a speech he gave in 46, but he's talking about when he was in charge in 22. He said Palestine was not to be a Jewish national home, but there was to be a Jewish national home in Palestine. That's what the Balfour Declaration said. Okay, so just as I'm looking at the notes as you go, you're saying, is Judaism a race or religion? It's complicated. We're a bit of a race, we're a bit of a religion. We don't really fit. So that's why he calls it the Jewish race. That's how he sees these things, even though you can convert into it. Anyway, look what he says. He says, Jewish immigration would be allowed up to the limit of economic absorptive capacity. That's a very important phrase. That was the phrase I coined in those days, which seems to remain convenient. Now, this land, look at it, economic absorptive capacity. A lot of other conservative leaders, British leaders, didn't want to annoy or upset the Arabs. So they didn't want too many Jews to come in because it would upset the Arabs, and they kept on limiting it. Churchill had a different approach. He said he understood the economy of basically flourishing the Middle East. He wanted Israel to grow. And if the Jews came in and could be absorbed and would work the land and grow it and be successful and not rely on handouts, then he was pro. And he was very angry that the Arabs would not grow the country in the same way. Right? Again, I hope I'm not being racist. You can read this in Sir Martin Gilbert's book. But time and again, the Arab population did not build economic infrastructure in the land and were reliant on many things, whereas the Jews invested and invested and invested, just like in modern Israel today, with all the modern technologies of the time, modern forms of irrigation, of clearing back the desert, of growing, of health, all these issues. And Churchill, as a state builder, loved their energy. He loved that creativity. And he said, as long as they have economic absorptive capacity, I will support them. Okay? Again, I haven't got time to read all these bits, but I really want you to read it because it's so interesting to read this long speech. Right? He said, we treated the Arabs very well. I'm jumping through here. This is a very long speech here. And he talks about when Labour came to power and the Conservatives without him, they started limiting the numbers that could come. And then he talks about the importance of getting the Americans on the side. This is why you might like this, about the Americans being supportive of the state of Israel. This is 1946, by the way. And you know, it took a very long time. Eventually, America did support, okay? But it took a very long time to get the Americans involved. And Churchill's talking about that and telling off the government. So again, we haven't got time to read the whole speech because I do want to get to the end. But I do want to show you the result of it. This table over here, look at this. In 1922, there were 590,000 Arabs in Israel and 84,000 Jews, okay? By 1940, look at the change, by the way, by 1931, that's Churchill. This is Churchill's changes, right? He allows in 100,000. And then in 1939, when he comes to power, right, 200,000 Jews more turn up as well. So by 1948, yes, there's 1 million Arabs, but there's 650,000 Jews. So when 6 Arab nations attack us in 1948, we had a chance. Even with that number, we nearly, I say we, because I relate to the land of Israel. I'm Israeli. I've got dual citizenship myself. But my father's Israeli. My mother's English, my father's Israeli. But look at this. Without that number, right, Ben Gurion wouldn't have had a chance. We would have lost in 48. We would have been driven into the sea and maybe annihilated in a second Holocaust. But that number was possible. And the man who fought the Labour and the Conservative and single-handedly guided that absorptive capacity was Winston Churchill. So to my mind, no Churchill in that seat with that positive view, no state of Israel. Okay? Now you might disagree with Churchill, but look what he said, great line. He said, history shall be kind to me, for I intend to write it. And he did. He wrote his history of the Second World War. Right? And a lot of what we know about this is Churchill's own words. But I'm a big fan of the man, as I admitted to you. Okay, there's a question talking, and there's good comments going on by Janet here about why there was no more bombing of the camps during the Second World War. And there's much debate about that. Gilbert talks about that, of what Churchill knew and what he didn't know during the war. And we'll see a little bit of quote about that maybe later on. If you read it, it's actually early on in the handout, you'll see that. So I'm not going to get into that now at this point. But I want to mention one other aspect of great leadership of Churchill, and this. As you can buy, I think it's 8 or 9 volumes, Churchill's summary of World War II. He goes through every aspect of World War II. But inside the cover of every volume, he printed this, the moral of the work. Do you ever see a leader like this today who has a moral kind of value that he stands for? And it's so Churchill. He says the following: in war, resolution. In defeat, defiance. In victory, magnanimity, and in peace, goodwill. Look at that. The need to fight and defy no matter what, and be resolute, and yet in victory to be magnanimous, and in peace to have goodwill, to move from one to the other. The summary of that ideology, every political leader of the world would gain a lot to read and learn from. Now, in that book, so it's getting quite dark here. I'm going to turn the light on. One moment, sorry. Yes, sorry about that. Might be light there, but it's 10 to 9 in Britain. Here we go. In his book, The Second World War, Volume 5, every time he gets to a new culture that's involved in the war, the Italians and the Greeks and the Spanish and every group, he talks a little bit about the ideology of that culture, what we talked about earlier, not individuals, but that culture. So when he gets to the part about the Greeks, right, fighting in the war, he goes classical. He starts talking about ancient Greece. Right? He talks about ancient Greece and for ancient Israel. And this quote is incredible. I'm going to read it in full because it's so amazing. And this tells you what he thought of us and his attitude to the ancient Israel and the ancient Greece. He says, the Greeks rival the Jews in being the most politically minded race in the world. This is not today, but this is in the past. No matter how forlorn their circumstances or how grave the peril to their country, they are always divided into many parties, with many leaders who fight among themselves with desperate vigor. 2 Jews, 3 opinions, 4 shuls, right? 4 synagogues. It has been well said that wherever there are 3 Jews, it will be found there are 2 prime ministers and 1 leader of the opposition. There you go, you can quote that. The same is true of this other ancient race, though stormy and endless struggle for life stretches back to the fountains of spring of human thought. Now listen. No 2 races have set such a mark upon the world. Both have shown a capacity for survival in spite of unending perils and sufferings from external oppressors, matched only by their ceaseless feuds, quarrels, and convulsions. So they fight no matter what, and they fight each other. That's a good description of the Jewish people, right? We fight each other, but we hold together and make change. The passage of several thousand years sees no change in their characteristics and no diminution of their original vitality. In that line, he's saying ancient Greece and ancient Israel relates to modern Greece to an extent and modern Jews. They have survived in spite of all that the world could do against them, and they could do against themselves. And each of them, from angles so different, have left us the inheritance of their genius and wisdom. Now, this quote is worth learning by heart. No two cities have counted more for mankind than Athens and Jerusalem. Their messages in religion, philosophy, and art have been the main guiding lights of modern faith and culture. Centuries of foreign rule and indescribable endless oppression leave them still living, active communities and forces in the modern world, quarreling amongst themselves, but with insatiable vivacity. Personally, I've always been on the side of both and believed in their invincible power to survive internal strife and the world tides threatening their extinction. That's amazing. I mean, for me, that's a Jew who is religious, but involved in the world, right? What I call, from my point of view, modern orthodoxy. But any Jew is committed to their faith and their traditions, but embraces the world of these two parts, Athens and Jerusalem, right? And Churchill says it beautifully in this way he looks at the world. So we see that deep down, he didn't just look at the Jews of a period. He looked at Jews in the context of the Bible. He looked at the Jews in the context of world history, and he saw a value to that race, to us. Let's finish off on the last two parts with Churchill, the Zionist. Some amazing quotes that he's given on this subject. In 1949, this is after he's no longer in power, right? This is just after 1948. Look at the way he talks about Israel, right? He talks about it dramatically. The coming into being of a Jewish state in Palestine is an event in the world to be viewed in the perspective, not of a generation or a century, but in the perspective of 1,000, 2,000 or 3,000 years. That's how we talk. We talk about the ancient first state of Israel under King Solomon and the second state of Israel when we came back and rebuilt the temple. Only Churchill thinks in this dramatic way. He understands the Jews in a dramatic historical way. Look at the next quote over here, right? And this now, this is in America. Look at this. Yes, I thought you liked this. In 1949, he's in New York to a Jewish audience asking about the rapidly concluding war between Israel and her Arab neighbors, which resulted in relationships with Egypt, Lebanon, and Jordan. So what does he say to the Americans in 49? Remember, Israel, they're not at peace yet. They're still fighting internally. He says, remember, I was for a free and independent Israel all through the dark years when many of my distinguished countrymen took a different view. So do not imagine for a moment that I will have the slightest idea of deserting you now in your time of glory. He came and spoke to a Jewish audience and said that. He said very clearly, I am a Zionist. Let me make that clear. I was one of the original ones after the Balfour Declaration, and I've worked faithfully for it. I think it is the most wonderful thing that this community should have established itself so effectively, turning the desert into fertile gardens and thriving townships, right? Who've suffered under Hitler, right? And my favorite quote about him in 55, remember this is after 48, the debates of whether Israel should get back Jerusalem. Here's a great quote. You ought to let the Jews have Jerusalem. It is they who made it famous. See, he reads the Bible. He says, you read the Bible, the Jerusalem was because of us. We built it. Yes, it became an important center for Muslims as well later on. But they're the ones who made it famous, right? So that was his power. And in 1961, he meets David Ben-Gurion. So I'm just trying to find something to show you before the end. Yes. David Ben-Gurion visits him and they have a wonderful conversation. And Ben-Gurion reminds Churchill that Churchill gave him his essay about Moses. And they have a wonderful relationship. And Ben-Gurion says, my dear Winston, and he says, your words and your deeds are indelibly engraved in the annals of humanity. Happy the people that has produced such a son, right? So this is the, ex-Prime Minister of Israel praising Churchill. Now, to finish off, let me go very British upon you. We've just got a few minutes to go towards the end. Look at this. I'm going to hold it up. I'll stop sharing for a moment so you can see me quite in the large. Look at this. Can you see? Am I large here, Ari? Can you see me? Yes. Okay. Good. This is, and I'll show it on the screen over here now. This is the memorial service for the Right Honourable Sir Winston Churchill at the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in Bevis Marks. And you have to understand, we only ever do services, the United Synagogue or the Sephardim, for royals. When the king dies, the synagogue will come together and do a special memorial service to show that we are loyal citizens of the country, and the head of the country is the king or the queen. That's what we do. Only once in all of British Jewish history have we done a great national memorial service for a non-royal. And who was that? Winston Churchill. And in the I run London School of Jewish Studies, a training college, and in our library, we have the original document. This was from 1965, the original memorial service for Sir Winston Churchill. I have the text over here, and I've got highlights for it. After he passed away on the 31st of January, this was the service that they did. And I want you to read just a couple of bits from it, because what they've done, the rabbis, clearly the Spanish and Portuguese community is the oldest community in England. And the synagogue Bevis Marks was built in 1701. That's how old that community is. And they've been praying for it ever since. By the way, just mention briefly in a moment, during lockdown, they can't go to the synagogue. And yet that synagogue has been in constant use since 1701. So what did the rabbi do there? And he's an American, but Spanish and Portuguese. He lives on site. And every day, he goes to the synagogue and puts on the top hat, which is what they wear, and puts on his talis and sits on his own in the bimah and davens the full service. And on Shabbat, takes out the Torah on his own and does everything so that everyone knows that that synagogue is still going. And I phoned him to say, good for you for doing it, Shalom. He's Rabbi Shalom Morris. He was the assistant rabbi in Lincoln Square for a little bit, American, and lives here as well. Wonderful guy. And I phoned him and said, Shalom, amazing what you're doing. You're keeping that community alive. And we come back, we are going to thank you for doing this. Okay? And the Sfardim take a long time to daven. Not like those Ashkenazim that rush through in 5 minutes. They take their time. Anyway, look what they quoted. Joshua, right? If you had to choose a verse of the Bible that summarized Churchill, what would you choose? I'd choose Joshua. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. So do not be terrified and dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. That's how Churchill spoke, right? Or from the wisdom of Solomon, the souls of the righteous are in the hand of God, and no torment shall touch them. They're at peace. Their hope is filled with immortality. The rabbis believed that Churchill's vision would be immortal. And then they quoted, very unusually, from Ecclesiastes ben Sirah, a very unusual text that had been found, an ancient text about leadership and heroes. And it's describing, let us now praise famous men. And look at the quote. I've highlighted 2 parts in bold. Giving counsel by their wisdom and foreseeing all their predictions. Sage and eloquent in their accounting. Careful in their narration. We're teaching Ben Sirah, we're talking is probably a 2nd, possibly 3rd century text. And the rabbi who put this together has chosen these words which typify Churchill. Great counsel, foreseeing, the Hebrew, v'chozeh kol neviotechem. Nevuah is prophecy. Right? When you look at Churchill's attitudes before the war and what he knew and what he looked for, he was really thinking ahead, and sage and eloquent in his speech and careful in his narration. He worked really hard on his speeches so they sounded natural, but he practiced and practiced them. That's what he would do. He'd write them on a special piece of paper and read them over and over again till they flowed beautifully and they had their effect. So no other Briton besides royals has ever had a memorial service done for him. And this is text from that. And now finally we see this statue, which, as I told you, unfortunately, was graffitied, but the graffiti's been wiped off now, of Churchill. The statue of Winston Churchill in Parliament Square. And it is located in a spot referred to in the 1950s by Churchill as where my statue will go. Right? His sense of history, right? So much so that he said, and when I die, this is where you'll put my statue. He's a man who understood his place in history. Now, you might see that as arrogance, but I think only people who don't understand what leadership is see that as arrogance. If you've ever had to be a leader, you have to have confidence and know what you are. And if you don't, you are not a great leader. It was unveiled in 1973 by his widow, his beloved Clementine, Baroness Spencer Churchill, at a ceremony attended by the Prime Minister, 4 former Prime Ministers, and the Queen. The statue is one of 12 statues of different leaders, statesmen. There's another statue of him in the House of Parliament as well. And when you come to England one day, I want you to go and visit Chartwell, which is in south of London. It was a wonderful place where he lived, and you can see him as a painter. And also in central London, you can visit the Cabinet War Rooms, which are where he ran the British government underground. And it's well known, by the way, they had to drag him down because when the sun was setting, he'd be on the roofs with his fist up to the Nazi planes flying over, saying, "Come on, come on." And they dragged him down. He took it personally. He fought in the First World War. He was a great, powerful and confident leader. So I hope I've shown you, and I'll take questions at the end, that Churchill had a deep connection to the Jewish people, to Jewish culture, to Jewish history, and the Bible. And his deep Christianity and respect for the Bible and ancient history and ideology, and the people who knew in Manchester, all bound together to make him a person that helped us have our homeland. And we must be thankful, I believe, to this man. So it's worth reading one book about him. You can read Churchill and the Jews by Martin Gilbert. You can read 5 Days in May. You can watch the Churchill movies. They're quite good as well. Fairly accurate, and be inspired. Is he perfect? No. Did he make mistakes? Yes, and he knew it as well. Many mistakes in his life. But a fascinating man, nevertheless. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rafi. Would you unshare the screen? We'll just take some questions.
Share, and, I'll just look at the chat over here first of all. Why does anyone graffiti a statue? Crazy. Well, if you just an answer, there are some in the north of England in Bristol, the statue of a guy who made all his money through the slave trade. He was a difficult, horrible man and insisted on that statue. And for years they were trying to bring it down. And you know what? There's a room for it. Are there any particular episodes to watch of Stranger Things or Transparent to prepare for your lecture? I will send that. That's for future stuff. I will send that to Ari in the coming weeks. Let's remind ourselves, and I'll send you the links. And I'm willing to take any questions you have about it. Before I answer, I am not an expert. I'm not a historian. I'm a rabbi. I'm a big fan, as you know, of Winston Churchill. I don't think he was perfect, but I think we owe him a lot. So,
I think. First of all, thank you for that thorough history of Winston Churchill and the Jews. I think that based on that, the question is, why is England where it is right now vis-a-vis Israel, given the challenges we've seen, I guess, within the more liberal party, and is there support within the conservative party? Why have things changed so much from what we just read about for that Winston Churchill?
Well, the truth is that the conservative government, which is in power now, has always had great support for Israel. We're doing roaring trade with Israel. It's very supportive of issues. Annexation will be a challenge for the British because it's one step maybe too far to understand what those issues are. But they're very supportive of Israel in many, many ways. And what's happened now is, in Labour, we had this terrible guy, Corbyn, who was this leader, very anti-Semitic, but the new leader, Keir Starmer, is very different. And I don't know if you read about this, I don't know if it made it to your country, but there was one of his cabinet, Long Bailey, who made a comment, who retweeted an anti-Semitic comment, and he called her and said, "You either retract or you're going to get fired." And she didn't retract, she made some kind of half-hearted apology, and he fired her, he kicked her out. He said zero tolerance for anti-Semitism. And he annoyed a lot of very left-wing people in his party, but they took it. This is, and the Jewish leaders have all said, this is the first true change of Labour. We now have a leader, Labour and Conservative, Boris Johnson, who are very pro-Jewish and are both very pro the land of Israel. So we're very lucky at the moment as British Jews. That's what I would say. Do
you have British Jews who are active in either party that are?
Yes, very much so. Very much involved in the Conservative and in the Labour Party. And there were some Jews who stayed in the Labour Party even when it went really downhill, because if they didn't stay and fight, it would never turn around. So even though people were upset they had to stay there, we understood why. They said, I'd rather fight anti-Semitism from within than from without.
People have asked questions about the handout. So anybody who's registered, which if you're on this program, it means you've registered, I will email you a private link to this recording, because we'll have it unlisted, and so you can kind of catch up on stuff, and then all the handouts that will be shared with me, I'll share with you.
But Churchill appreciated complexity. It would be a real shame to oversimplify. That's why to give you the full text. But when you read it over, his words it gets a bit of time getting used to his eloquence, but it really helps.
From your studies, and this is not really your main. I mean, you're not a historian, you're a rabbi, and you're a text teacher. And what we're going to focus on in August is your playfulness with Jewish text and contemporary entertainment, television and movies. And I've read a lot of your stuff. And so this is a little bit more, I guess, a different type of presentation for you. But in your readings and your research, have you found people who don't agree with this interpretation of Churchill see him as being anyway anti-Semitic or anti-Israel? Because what you've presented obviously seems really in one directional, but we haven't read everything. We haven't done the research.
No, there are some outliers who argue, I'll explain this phrase KBO, I'm typing in. There are some outliers who try and argue that he was anti-Semitic because they just quote unfully some parts. And there was even a fake text that they quoted that Churchill said, and this is the far right who try and argue, because they love Churchill in the Second World War, they find him a very British leader, therefore they've got to show, if they're anti-Semitic, that he was anti-Semitic as well. But no, it's mainstream. Martin Gilbert, again, is the national biographer of Churchill. It's very much mainstream how supportive he was. There is a debate about why they didn't bomb the camps in Auschwitz, but there's a whole big debate about the positives and negatives of that, and that involves quite a lot to explain. I put this phrase KBO on over here because it's an important phrase that he used to sign a lot of his letters during the war. And because we're going through coronavirus and we all need chizuk is strength, I thought I'd give it to you. Right, he always wrote KBO. Do you know what KBO stands for? Keep buggering on. Just keep going. Keep buggering on. That's what he would sign his letters. That's his way of saying just keep going in a very British way. Do you want me to respond to the chat questions, Ari?
Yeah, 1 second. One more question.
Sure.
We here in America have very short-term memory. We remember some of our leaders and not many. Is Winston Churchill still remembered fondly within the Jewish community in England? Is that he's still actively thought of?
Absolutely. He's, the church and Martin Gilbert is this great historian. Every British Jew for their bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah got a book of Martin Gilbert's maps and history. And we're all big fans of Martin Gilbert. And he wrote this book, Churchill and the Jews, which is, you can read just in a few hours if you want to just read through the whole thing. And it's very well known and sells a lot still to this day. Just in terms of comments, Churchill and Roosevelt, there's a whole book about it. I only know a bit. I know there was a good affection that they had for each other and appreciation. Thank you for references. Was Churchill involved in implementing the kinder transport to England? I don't know. I don't know about that. I haven't read about that. It's possible, but I don't know. What was Churchill education and background? Yeah, he went to private schools. He was one of the nines. Do you know what the nines are? In Cambridge, you can get a first or a second, an upper second or a lower second or a third. I don't know the equivalent Americans. I suppose a first is like a top distinction, and then merit and just a pass. So the lowest pass you can get is the third. If you get a third 3 years in a row, you're part of the nines. People who do just enough work to pass. And all the geniuses were nines because they understand. My friend Andrew Zucker, who learned to fly while he was in flies of British Airways, was one of the nines in Cambridge, a special group, and Churchill was part of that. He wasn't distinguished in school. He got kept down a couple of years. That's why his grammar was so good, because he learned it 3 times over. If you want, and you stop recording, I will tell you an off-color story about him, which is in Boris Johnson's book called Churchill. Now, Boris Johnson, I think it's 4 or 5 years ago now, wrote a modern book on Churchill, which is just as much about Boris Johnson as it is about Churchill, right? But he talks about Churchill in a very dramatic way to make the whole country really appreciate him. Is it still recording, Ari? Because I'll do it. If you stop recording, then I'll tell the story.
I will turn it off.
We'll end here. So if you want to hear the story,